Bonjour à tous. Nous allons tester les microphones de la salle W. Merci.
think we can start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yuvan Bijador. I'm Senior Advisor to the Director General of the WTO. Thank you so much for joining this 85th session of the World WTO Public Forum. The Big Blue Agenda: can small and vulnerable economies and small island developing states thrive in a reglobalized world? Before I introduce these panelists, I'd like to just give a big warm welcome to all of you for making time during your busy schedule to join this session, and also pass you the best wishes of the Director General, who is in another meeting and couldn't make it for our meeting. Very quickly, the strategic context of this session. This week, during the public forum, you've heard the Director General, you've heard Indermit Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank, Jason Furman from Harvard, Ralph Osa, our Chief Economist, Annabel Gonzalez from the IADB, and a number of other key panelists who have articulated very strongly a key message. The world trading system is at a critical juncture. Developing countries are at a critical juncture. We're only 6 years away from the achievement of the SDGs. In a few days from now, the Summit of the Future, convened by the Secretary General, leaders around the world will be meeting to really rethink about what do we do about the SDGs? How do we accelerate progress? How do we bring in more growth, more sustainable growth for the future generations? So with this global context, what does it mean for small islands and small and vulnerable economies? How do they navigate those trade challenges that they're facing? How do they build better growth for the future? How do they capitalize on this thrive of reglobalization or distributed supply chains? How do they add more value to their products, whether it be in aquaculture, whether it be in cancer research products, whether it be in aquatic foods, whether it be in ocean energy? How do we ensure that developing countries really benefit from reglobalization? The vast blue economy that we know about, a $24 trillion economy by some estimates of the Boston Consulting Group, can only be sustainable if we use it judiciously, if we use it in a very smart and sustainable way. Oftentimes, that's not the case. And joining me on the panel today, we'll be having experts, ministers who are in the crack of those discussions of policymaking. Joining me today on this panel, I'd like to first of all introduce Dr. Indermit Gill, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for Development Economics at the World Bank Group. It's not every day that we have a Chief Economist from the World Bank at a senior WTO meeting, but with the leadership of the Director General, with Dr. Gill, with many old friends and partners, we're very, very delighted to welcome Dr. Gill, who'll provide an overview of some of the big structural challenges that SIDS and SVs are really facing themselves in today. We'll have a good sense of what kind of support maybe even the bank group and other international financial institutions can provide for SVs and SIDS. We will be joining also then on the panel is His Excellency Mr. Mustafa Hassani Mohammed, Minister of the Economy, Industry, Investments, and responsible for economic integration of the Union of Comoros. Minister, welcome to Geneva. You're one of the youngest members of the WTO. It's very, very, very nice for you to come all the way from Comoros to Geneva. We will also have Her Excellency Miss Oneje Walron, Minister of Tourism, Industry and Commerce of Guyana, an extremely fast-growing economy. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us as well, all the way from Guyana. We will have one of our most loved ambassadors in Geneva, very dynamic, very active, our good friend Matthew Wilson, His Excellency Ambassador Matthew Wilson, permanent representative of Barbados to the UN offices in Geneva and other international organizations in Geneva. And we will also have as a respondent, Ms. Glada Lan, Senior Fellow from Chatham House, who's kindly joined us from London. Without much ado, allow me to give the floor to Dr. Indermit Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank Group.
So thank you, Yuvan. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm going to get right into it. I'm going to show you a few slides. As soon as they're up, we can get this going. But small states face big challenges, but it's also true that the sustainable development of the blue economy offers tremendous opportunities, right? So I want to actually set the stage really quickly by focusing on the two challenges that face small states as they try to sort of take advantage of these opportunities. The first has to do with how to tackle the barriers to economic growth, and then the second is how to strengthen fiscal policy, right? And then we can talk more about other things then. But I'm going to quickly take you through these slides. I hope you can see them well. But essentially, on the left side chart, what you see is that small states are much more exposed to highly damaging natural disasters than other emerging market and developing economies. So all of these charts, most of these charts have the small states on one side and emerging market and developing economies other than the small states in comparison, right? And you see that because many of them are small tropical islands, they're especially vulnerable to large storms. And we've been reminded of this recently by the loss of life and damage caused by Hurricane Beryl. Now, second, if you look at the middle chart, it shows that they're far more open to trade than other emerging market and developing economies. So trade openness is much greater. And this exposes them to adverse global economic developments. So just like they are hit by natural shocks, they're also hit by economic shocks because they are more reliant on imported goods and services. And invariably, they have more concentrated export sectors as well. I'll show you some more slides on that, right? And in particular, what you sort of see over here is that many of them are highly reliant on international tourism. And as these countries found out during the COVID crisis and so on, that can actually keep you very, very exposed to shocks, external shocks. And so they basically are much more exposed to greater output and fiscal volatility than other emerging markets and developing economies, right? So if you look at these features, in fact, actually, if you look at what happened to these countries over time, you'll see that on the left side chart that they contracted by more than 10% in 2020, much more than other emerging market developing economies. And some of them, especially the tourism exporters, actually suffered the largest losses. Now, the other thing, what we see is that recovery from the pandemic has also been slower in these small states, especially in the East Asia and Pacific, by the way, where reopening after the pandemic has been delayed quite a bit, right? So if you look at the middle chart, what you see is that GDP is actually projected to be around 7 percentage points below pre-pandemic trends. So in a sense, these states have yet to recover from the pandemic-related shocks, right? And it looks like that's not going to happen even in 2025 or 2026 or even further down the road. Okay, so this is a permanent loss in output. Okay. Now, the other thing, as you sort of see on the right side chart, is that these economies, besides the greater volatility, and probably in part related to that, they actually have much lower growth rates as compared to other emerging markets and developing economies. Their growth rates are roughly the same as rich countries, right? So they have much lower income levels and the same growth rates as advanced economies, okay? Now, if you look at this third slide, you look at the fiscal policy side, right? So how capable are governments to actually handle these shocks and so on? And if you sort of look at this, you find that if you look at the left chart, it shows that since the onset of the pandemic, actually around 3/4 of small states have had weaker primary balances than before the pandemic. Okay, 3/4 of them, okay? as compared with less than 2/3 for the others. And then if you look at the debt levels, you actually find that debt levels were higher in small states as compared to other emerging economies back in 2011, 20 years back. They are still much higher and higher still now you see that while debt has gone up in other emerging markets too, but small states have gone up from about 35% of public debt to actually it's closer to about 60% now. So a big thing. Basically, what this means is that these countries, besides being subject to greater risk, besides being subject to greater natural risks and greater economic risks, they're also subject to greater financial risks, right? Or greater fiscal risks. Okay. Then if you sort of look at all of this stuff, of course, if you have very strong governance mechanisms and so on, you can offset that. You can offset those things by really good economic management and so on. When you look at these very sort of rough indicators of the quality of governance, you actually find that emerging markets and developing economies tend to have somewhat better governance quality than other emerging markets, right? But you find that they are way lower than those of advanced economies. So they are basically closer to the governance mechanism, closer to governance quality in other emerging markets and developing economies. And remember all the charts that I showed you before this, in terms of their growth, in terms of their trade, in terms of their exposure, and so on, it's actually much worse than these countries. So they ought to have much better. They basically have to have they have to improve the quality of the governance to levels that are closer to those of advanced economies. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And then if you sort of look at some of these other indicators that actually do depend on the quality of governance, like trade connectivity and costs, you see that that small states tend to be far less connected than other emerging markets, and of course, much less connected than advanced economies. You also find that because they rely a lot on revenues from imports and so on, their tariff rates are much higher too. Okay, so the tariff rates are twice those of other emerging markets and developing economies. And then if you look at digital connectivity, you actually find that while the Latin America and Caribbean small states do better than other emerging markets, you actually find that the small states in East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa actually do much worse on digital connectivity too. So I think there are things that the East Asian small states and the Sub-Saharan African small states can learn from the Latin American countries, the Caribbean countries, and so on how to improve digital connectivity. I know that lots of really important initiatives are being undertaken by countries like Jamaica right now, and Barbados and so on, and that helps the small states. Okay, so then if you look at the fiscal policy, this is slide number 5. You see that small states actually do rely a lot on non-tax revenues, such as grants. So if you look at this chart, for example, you find that the composition of government revenue, despite the fact that small states tend to have a higher per capita income level than emerging markets and developing economies other than small states, they actually depend a lot more on grants than do these other countries. And they depend less on taxes, okay? And then, so then if you look at the middle part, that kind of starts to look in a very rough, crude way. It looks at spending efficiency. And there what you sort of find is that the spending efficiency tends to be lower than those of other emerging markets, right? And their fiscal frameworks tend to be somewhat less strong than those of other markets. These are very, very sort of rough indicators and so on. And there are small states that actually do better than emerging economies, emerging markets and developing countries, but on average, they do worse. So then if you sort of look at global policies, you actually do find that small states as a percentage of their GDP, what you see is that ODA, the average of ODA between 2011 and 2023, the last 10 years or so, you actually find that ODA as a share is much greater, 3 times as much perhaps, in small states as compared with other emerging markets and developing economies. So it's not the case that the rest of the world doesn't care about them. You actually do see this. And then, but if you look at them The flip side of this is that these countries are also much more dependent on these grants or ODA, as well as the International Development Association, the IDA countries, the trusts that the World Bank administers. Okay. I just wanted to give you all of that stuff as a way to think. And I was told that the cost of the unit that prepared these slides, the cost that they imposed on me was to advertise all their other work. So this, by the way, this unit is a great resource. So if you have any sort of special meetings on small states or landlocked states, etc., you should come to us and we can tailor slides for you. We can tailor presentations and reports for you. This unit is brilliant. It's called the World Bank Global Prospects Group. I'll stop here. Is that okay, Yuvan?
Thank you so much, Indermit. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for these insights. You know, for those economic geeks in the room, for those of you who know Indermit, he's the author, the brains, the firepower behind the middle income trap term and studies eventually that led to this year's World Development Report on middle income trap. Very, very important. Maybe we'll get back to that, Indermit. You've talked about it in the sessions today and yesterday, because some small islands are higher income, some are middle income, some are low income. So I'm sure there's a lot of experience and lessons that could be shared also from the World Development Report. But thank you very much for the World Bank Chief Economist for these perspectives. Maybe let me turn to our brother who came all the way from my elder brother. And I had the mistake of asking him if he went to my country, a small island developing state as well, Mauritius, because not only he went, but he knew all the towns of Mauritius, including our favorite, Quatre Bornes. So, Minister, thank you so much for coming. You are one of the youngest members of the WTO, 165th, just before Timor-Leste. And let me also thank Director Ratnakar Adhikari for making this session also possible with us, the EIF ED.
I thought you were going to say 165 years old. I thought, boy, the WTO members are very old.
How do you see the sort of the post-accession era now for the Comoros? What are your expectations from the WTO, from the multilateral trading system? For so many years, you've been negotiating. For so many years, it's been difficult. I remember when I was in Mauritius, how difficult it was for Comoros to export some of its fish products. How do you see the future of Comoros? President Assoumani chaired the African Union very successfully. You've put your country on the world map. How do you address those issues of fragmentation, geopolitics, new shipping routes? How do you address these? How do you see the future of Comoros?
Excuse-moi. Bonjour tout le monde. Merci, monsieur le modérateur. Comme vous l'avez dit, je viens des îles Comores, un petit pays qui se trouve dans l'océan Indien, dans le canal de Mozambique, voisin de votre île d'origine, l'île Maurice. Je suis arrivé à ce poste il y a exactement 2 mois en tant que ministre de l'économie. Et avant de répondre à votre question, monsieur le modérateur, je voudrais saisir cette opportunité qui m'est offerte pour remercier le secrétariat de l'OMC de m'avoir fait l'honneur en m'invitant à prendre part à cette session d'importance capitale pour mon pays au regard de sa situation de vulnérabilité. Permettez-moi de remercier aussi tous les pays membres de l'OMC qui nous ont aidés à accéder à cette organisation. Vous savez, comme vous l'avez dit, ça a été un long chemin pour arriver jusque-là. Depuis 2007 que les Comores ont déposé leur demande d'accession à l'OMC. Et c'était justement cette année, en 2024, que nous avons pu arriver à destination. C'est une grande fierté et satisfaction de la part de tous les Comoriens et plus particulièrement l'actuel chef de l'État, son Excellence le président Azali Assoumani, parce que c'est sous son mandat que les négociations ont été reprises depuis 2016. Il est vrai que notre pays, les Comores, c'est un petit pays où même la population est de 1 million d'habitants, nous sommes à peu près 800 000, et puis il est confronté à beaucoup de problèmes, surtout problèmes environnemental, aussi au niveau des climatiques, tant de problèmes. Déjà, avec notre accession à l'OMC, nous espérons beaucoup de choses. Nous rêvons aller loin, rejoindre ces pays qui sont déjà partis. Prendre l'exemple, rien que nos voisins qui sont là, votre île, l'île Maurice, les Seychelles, aussi la Réunion, rien que pour ça, sans aller plus loin. Et c'est déjà un chemin qui a été tracé par le chef de l'État actuel, c'est-à-dire voir les Comores parmi les pays émergents. Surtout, il a fixé le calendrier l'année 2030, c'est-à-dire rien que pour fixer les jalons et les piliers de cette émergence. Donc, nous ne pouvons pas y arriver seuls. Nous avons besoin de l'appui de tout le monde, de nos pays, nos partenaires et multilatéraux, et aussi des organisations telles que l'OMC pour nous accompagner à arriver à cette émergence et aussi faire partie de ces pays développés. Merci.
Très bien. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre, pour ces perspectives. Thank you very much, Minister. Maybe I can turn to Her Excellency Minister Wellren, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. When Diana, who's been instrumental, she's one of our young professionals from Guyana, told me that it was a 35% growth of real GDP, I nearly fell off my chair, but I didn't because we islanders, we are resilient. So I didn't fall off. But I want to ask you, Minister, how is Guyana navigating global fragmentation, geopolitics? Surely, yes, you're well endowed with natural resources. I do recall in 2007, President Barrett Jackdale was one of the first ones who really started speaking so strongly about forests and the value of forests. I remember that when I was at the World Bank. So I'm really interested to know now, where is Guyana situated in all these challenges? How are you navigating that? But more importantly, how are you developing those new blue sectors, whether it be ecotourism, whether it be fishing, whether it be nature-based solutions? How are you doing it? And are there some really good lessons you could share with us? Because it's clearly you are on a very upward, strong trajectory for greater growth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. And well, you'll be pleased to know that for this year, it's 49% growth so far. It's unprecedented. And so this is largely attributed to our in recent times, oil finds. But what has been important for Guyana is that we do not become reliant on the oil and gas, which, as you know, is non-renewable. And so we have embarked on the strategy to diversify our economy, to develop the non-oil sectors. So what we're seeing is also double-digit growth in our non-oil sectors, agriculture, services, the infrastructure development, and tourism. So what we have, you've mentioned Dr. Barrett Jackdale, our former president, and now under our current president, Dr. Ali, is our low carbon development strategy that has been relaunched. It's now the 2030 low carbon development strategy, where we see the environment and development have to go hand in hand. Guyana, for those of us who's not aware, has a forest the size of Scotland and England combined. 86% of our country is covered by rainforest, one of the few countries with intact rainforests. And what we have, our low carbon development strategies, the focus is to develop our country despite being an oil producing country, while doing so sustainably and doing so maintaining our environment and maintaining the recognition that we have as preserving our forests, our rainforests, and our biodiversity. The Guyana is the first country in 2022 that has been accredited under the R3s. We have the first jurisdictional carbon credit standard under the R3 standard. And a few months later, after this accreditation, we had the world's largest carbon credit sale to Hess Corporation for 750 million US. This is our carbon credit. Our forest absorbs 19.5 gigatons of CO2, of carbon dioxide. And so we are indeed part and instrumental of being the lungs of the earth. And we have been able to leverage this, our carbon sink, in the international market. This is our approach and a market model to getting monetizing our forests, monetizing our biodiversity. Further, the Guyana's credits has been first in the world to be accepted under the United Nations Aviation Reduction Program, and this position as well, again, for forest sales in the next coming months and years. We also, from under President Barry Jagdeo in the 90s, we have world-class monitoring and verification system where it comes to our forests. So even though we have our timber and logging practices, it is done sustainably, and we have sought and have gained international certification for our logging services and the verification process. This also opens up Guyana for funding in the markets for our timber because of this international certification. So we say all this to say that we have embarked on a sustainable, focused path of the development agenda that considers our biodiversity to keep our forests intact. We are the first country, we're leading, and we're very proud that we're leading in this regard. And indeed, the biodiversity and the blue economy, sustainable fishing practices are all part of our agenda to continue to use the environment and our forest and fishing to leverage that for economic advancement for the country. And this is all outside of our oil and gas fortunes.
Thank you so much, Minister. It does address a lot of questions, a lot of pertinent questions that you've raised. And it's really interesting to hear some of those perspectives, especially that you're really focusing on sustainable practices, which I think is essential for this conversation as to how we keep those natural resources intact or alive or regenerated and more healthy and more prosperous. This is also to a large extent the basis of the agreement on fishery subsidies, which is to ensure that the oceans is replenished through the good practices on the fisheries agenda, so that we can really benefit from a healthy ocean for the future. Just to remind for colleagues here that the WTO, through consensus, ministers agreed in 2022 on the agreement on fishery subsidies, basically the elimination of harmful fishery subsidies. We're talking about more than $22 billion a year. And if we start looking at overfishing and overcapacity, that's obviously even more. That's the second wave of the negotiations. So just a small parenthesis on the urgency for members to continue their ratification processes and depositing their instruments of accessions to the Director General. We're at 83, so we just need a few the last mile before we get this agreement to enter into force. Let me turn to His Excellency Ambassador Wilson from Barbados. Matthew, you've been around in Geneva at the WTO, at the International Trade Center. You've been a seasoned diplomat. Your Prime Minister, Her Excellency Maya Mottley, has articulated extremely boldly well the Bridgetown Initiative so that developing countries, small islands, vulnerable economies can access the financial architecture better, so that we can get financing in a much faster way, but that we also do change the financial architecture and unleash capital in a much more smart and easy way. I'd like to ask you, in your view, is the WTO doing enough for small and vulnerable economies and small island developing states? Currently, you're chairing the ACP, so you have a very unique way of looking at things. You don't need to give me the ACP perspective, but rather from your perspective, is the WTO doing enough on SIDS and SVEs?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yvonne. And as I just mentioned to the minister, with a 49% growth, Guyana will be hosting all of the future Caribbean rum parties moving forward. That's amazing, 49%. I'm going to be quite circular in how I respond to your question, Yvonne, because I really want to highlight what are some of the priorities of small states like Barbados when it comes to issues of the blue economy and when it comes to issues of trade. I think is really important. A lot of people call us big ocean states because clearly our ocean space is much, much bigger than our land space. I'm not sure how I feel about that designation yet, because it creates this illusion of ownership, over our oceans and the vast potential within it. It makes it seem that we're able to survey and leverage these incredible resources, that we have the right financing, that we have the right technology to exploit the potential in the global commons. And the fact is that we simply do not. We are like landlords, gifted acres and acres of land that we simply cannot use. And this is my first point. SIDS will need to rely on fair global cooperation to sustainably manage our blue economy and our green economy in ways that can contribute to addressing some of the global problems that we're facing. And the WTO has a crucial role to play there by giving us a voice, by making sure that there is a discussion here in the WTO on the relationship between trade policy and the climate crisis, and to come up with concrete solutions for us to be able to improve our extremely vulnerable state. Because the blue economy, which is not something that we necessarily discuss in the WTO in a very concrete way, is a real game changer for small island developing states if we do it properly, if SIDS are in the driver's seat. And far too often, SIDS and small states have been regulatory takers rather than regulatory makers. And here, when it comes to the blue economy, we have got to be at the forefront of developing how this unfolds. And I believe that here in the WTO, we have a shared responsibility to do that. And I want to pick up on something you said, Yvonne, about fisheries, because we cannot delink oceans. We cannot delink the health of small island developing states from fish. And we cannot delink fish from IUU fishing and harmful fishery subsidies. And I can tell you, along the shores of Barbados, I have seen with my own eyes machinery and waste from foreign IUU fishing vessels washing up on our beaches. So IUU fishing is real and it has disastrous consequences. And I simply have one request: ratify Fish 1. On harmful fishery subsidies, I don't think I need to go into detail on that. We know the score. We know who does it. We know who can't do it, who can't afford to do it. Small states cannot afford to give huge amount of subsidies. And we have an agreement on the table that is the closest we have ever come to multilateral rules on fisheries. So my request is simple. Let's get it done and close the negotiations. My third point is we have to really work on harnessing the incredible potential of the ocean. That means encouraging investment in marine renewable energy sources. offshore wind farms, wave and tidal energy, and all of this will reduce reliance on fossil fuels, which is another issue that we are discussing here within the WTO ecosystem. And maybe later I can go into some of the exact things that Barbados is doing. But I wanna end on where you asked me to start, Uvan, which is on financing. And this is a subject that a lot of people don't like to talk about. And I heard Dr. Gill, and thank you so much, speak about the amount of ODA going to small states, which I have to say surprised me because it doesn't feel like that. Especially those of us who are from middle income or high income states, it doesn't feel like we're getting a lot of ODA, and it doesn't feel like we're getting a lot of assistance, and it doesn't feel like we're getting a lot of grants. We're getting a lot of loans, and we know where that will lead us. So I think we have to recognize that sustainability is expensive. Everyone is talking about sustainability, but sustainability is expensive, especially for small states. So we need to have predictable financing, and we need to have grant financing rather than loans, because the worst thing that could happen is that we try to transform our economy into a green economy, and then we're left even more indebted than we are today. So I think we really need to turbocharge global sustainable financial support and debt relief. The two of them have to go together. And we need to really enhance efforts to develop new sustainability models. And this is where the Bridgetown Initiative comes in, which is something that was piloted by Barbados, by Prime Minister Mia Mottley, but really taken on board by a number of developing countries. And it calls for, rather modestly, a full regeneration and re-engineering of the international financial architecture. And what makes this Bridgetown Initiative so special but so obvious is that we put a number of problems on the table, but right away we put forward solutions as well, which is that the international financial architecture has got to be more responsive to small states. It's got to be more responsive to climate financing. And we've seen a lot of really positive deliverables there. We've seen natural disaster clauses now included in loan agreements. Just 2 weeks ago, I believe Grenada used that as it relates to Barrow, which essentially means that you pause the repayment of debt and loans so that you're able to build up your resilience. And this is really, really important for small states. The Bridgetown Initiative was key in helping put the loss and damage fund high on the agenda. And right now in Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, which is the newest iteration, we're really trying to get the private sector to have a role in financing climate change, because we cannot do this just with public sector money. And we're also bringing in new actors like philanthropists to say that you also have a role to play in helping to support the global commons. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This is really great. I mean, a lot of important questions that you asked, but that you've also pointed towards. And I'm really happy that, you know, you are exactly how SIDS are doing it, which is they are moving forward irrespective of the challenges. But having said that, I still want to ask Indemit, you've been around the international organizations for many years. Indemit, you've worked in so many different rich backgrounds. You studied at Duke University, which has a fascinating marine program as well. I want to ask you honestly, as you see the global picture right now of geopolitics, wars, fragility, climate change, you name it, are you positive for SIDS? You've looked at middle-income countries for many years, but what about SIDS and small vulnerable economies? Are you honestly positive about the fact that they can really make it with higher value chains, with better products, better services, tap into the digital economy, the blue economy? When I was at the World Bank, we led some studies on Mauritius on you know, doubling the share of the ocean economy to 25% over the next 17 years. But we're yet to see the benefits of that, because there's so many other questions. I'd like to ask your honest perspective as to whether you're positive about the future of SIDS and small and vulnerable economies.
So, you know, small states, island economies, they tend to have, I guess, 2 or 3 things going against them, right? So the first one, of course, is that because they are small, they tend not to be able to enjoy the economies of scale. And there are two types of economies of scale. One of them is how to sort of that you can't easily have a very small government, for example, as a share of government spending to GDP, because there are economies of scale in governance. That's the first one. And then the second one, of course, there are economies of scale in production and all too. And you mentioned these global value chains and so on. It's harder for a small economy to get into these global value chains and so on. That's the first part. The second part is that economic growth in the rest of the world is slowing down. So if I had to sort of tell you, roughly speaking, in the first decade of this millennium, compare that to the second, to the third, which is this one. So emerging markets were growing at around 6% in the first decade. It went down to 5 in the second, and it's 4 in this one. Okay, so the rest of the world is not doing nearly as well as it was earlier. That has implications for the small economies and so on, because things like tourism and so on, they all depend on those things, right? And then, of course, what also depends, to the extent that advanced economies are also doing worse. So they are, so just like you spoke about the middle income trap, the similar phenomenon or the analogous phenomenon for high income economies is secular stagnation. Because of demography, because of slowing productivity and so on, their growth rates are slowing down too. So the things that Matthew mentioned about grants and so on, I would sort of say you have to expect fewer grants. You're not going to get the same kind of grants that you did in the past. And then the third point, which is that to the extent that natural disasters and so on are becoming more severe and so on, that's the third thing that these countries have to these countries have to deal with. So I would say sort of there are two or three things that these countries have to do. So the first one, of course, is if you look at where these countries figure on things like ease of doing business, which we discontinued a few years back, but which we are resuming with a new measure called business readiness. If you look at that, if you look at women, business, and the law, I mean, trying to sort of bring women into the mainstream of the economy and so on. I'm talking about economic growth now. So these are things that small states can do themselves. Okay. And if you sort of look at this, you actually find that this is not particularly good. So, for example, if I take Barbados, the last time we assessed Barbados in the ease of doing business, it was 128th in the world. When you're that small, you shouldn't be 128th. You should be in the same neighborhood as the South Koreas and others, not in the same neighborhood as Nepal. No? Okay, so then that's the first thing. The second thing is that, you have to find ways to manage your fiscal resources better, because economic growth rates and so on, you would expect them to slow down to the extent that interest rates are going to remain. Interest rates may come down, but international interest rates are going to remain high for a bit, at least for the next 5-6 years. So as a result of that, so if you have a public debt to GDP ratio of 125%, as Barbados does, you're not in a strong position. Okay, and of course the fact is that because these economies are more vulnerable, I showed you the charts on that one. These things tend to go up. That you tend to run. You sometimes have to run fiscal deficits because you get hit by a hurricane and so on. But if you look at Barbados, you actually find that the average debt to GDP ratio between 2012 and 2022 was 140%. And I think that Barbados was really hit by a severe hurricane, to the end of that, towards the end of that period. So it was already highly indebted when it was hit by a hurricane after 3 or 4 decades. Okay, so again, you end up being in a very weak position. And then the last bit is this, I mean, if you look at Barbados, it has a per capita income of about $20,000. I mean, the typical emerging market economy has a per capita income that's 1/10 that, okay, or 1/8 that. So even if you are talking about grants and things like that, you would not, you know, by any objective indicator, you're not going to be a thing. Even a country like Guyana, which has a per capita income of about 10,000, or Seychelles, which is 14,000, or Mauritius, which is 10,000, these are not going to be at the topmost of the list. I mean, these are countries that are upper middle income economies. Comoros is lower, is 2,000. So I think. So my answer to your point is that yes, the external environment is not that great. Okay. And then the second one is, if you look at the quality of governance and so on, which is in the control of these governments, okay, that has to, that's not that great either. And so what can these countries do? They're small economies. Well, they can do two things. One is they can try to change the international economic environment. Best of luck, okay? And then the second one is to try to change their own economic environment. All the help that you want from the World Bank, you'll get it, okay? Then the third thing, of course, is, you know, to the extent... we
All the
we
help
are
you need from the World Bank.
we are very fond of our small states client. Just so you know, we give we give very special terms for small states, and all the way. But the last point is this: I think that to the extent that Prime Minister Mia Mottley and others can exercise their considerable influence, you know, I think that help given to these countries, or to any country, any developing country, on the mitigation side should not be seen as development aid. It should be seen as their own spending, okay? Because it's a global, first, because it's a global good. And then the second one is, in terms of who caused this problem, it is them. Okay. I mean, they didn't do it intentionally, but ultimately, if you do, if you do an accounting, it's them. So for that reason, I would sort of say that you do require a reclassification of this. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Indamit. This is fascinating, and I hope sincerely that the WTO and World Bank can really do a bit more diagnostics work, programmatic eventually, who knows, but collaborate a bit deeper on the SIDS agenda. Maybe I'd ask the Minister from Comoros. Excellency, you've heard a bit the challenges that the Chief Economist sees, but opportunities as well. I'd like to ask you, what would define success for Comoros over the next 3-4 years, 5 years, for your government, to ensure that those challenges are met, so that, you know, the ilang that you're producing, the vanilla, the cloves, which are well known to the world, and thanks to the EIF programs as well, there's a lot of capacity around that. But how do we move beyond that to have more value in the products and services that you export? Of course, tourism is one key element of your strategy. But do you see other ingredients of success for Comoros over the next 5 years?
Merci, monsieur le modérateur. L'intervention de mon voisin qui est à gauche, là, devrait suffire déjà, parce qu'il a beaucoup parlé de nos petits pays, insulaires, là. Il a dit beaucoup de choses là-dessus. On dirait qu'il habite dans ces petites îles-là, parce qu'il a beaucoup parlé. Pour répondre à vos questions, je voudrais partager quelques notes que j'ai prises ici. C'est-à-dire, ce nouveau statut de pays membre de l'OMC permettra à l'Union des Comores de mieux s'organiser pour se créer une place de choix dans ce vaste marché mondial, en tirant parti et en capitalisant sur ses avantages comparatifs, notamment dans le domaine de l'écotourisme. Ce qui peut non seulement améliorer ses gains économiques, mais aussi contribuer de manière significative aux efforts mondiaux d'atténuation des effets des changements climatiques par sa participation à la production des services les plus grands la plus grande valeur est respectée de l'environnement. Avec l'appui indéfectible de nos partenaires, notamment le cadre intégré renforcé, la Banque mondiale, l'Union européenne, pour ne citer que cela, nous avons beaucoup travaillé et nous continuons à travailler pour développer le secteur de l'écotourisme, à faire en sorte que la destination Comores soit reconnue comme étant une destination écotouristique. Et pour cela, nous avons adopté une approche communautaire pourvoyeuse d'emploi sur un certain nombre de sites, dont celui de Mont Cartala, qui est le plus haut sommet du pays. Justement, encore avec l'appui de nos partenaires, nous travaillons pour renforcer la compétitivité des principales filières dont vous venez de parler, surtout au niveau filière ylang-ylang, la vanille, le jove, qui sont les principaux produits de rente que nous cultivons et nous exportons à l'étranger. À travers non seulement l'accompagnement des acteurs locaux pour l'amélioration de la qualité de leur production, mais aussi l'accompagnement pour un meilleur accès au marché, voire même la transformation. Donc, sur ça, le gouvernement actuel s'est engagé également à orienter vers la diversification de son offre exportable en s'intégrant davantage dans la chaîne de valeur mondiale de ces filières, mais pour en ajouter la valeur de transformation. C'est-à-dire, je vais dire ici que la politique du gouvernement actuel, c'est d'inciter des investisseurs étrangers à venir transformer les produits locaux que nous cultivons au lieu de l'exporter et les exporter vers l'étranger. Parce que nous savons que quand les transformant au niveau local, ça va nous permettre d'avoir une valeur ajoutée à ce produit et ça va créer aussi de l'emploi, surtout pour les jeunes Comoriens, parce qu'actuellement, vous savez qu'aux Comores, nous sommes parmi les pays qui ont un taux de chômage plus élevé. Et puis,
Je voudrais demander une question à ce propos,
ça.
Monsieur le ministre. C'est
Voilà.
excellent que vous mentionniez ce point sur ce qu'on appelle le brain drain.
Ouais.
Comment est-ce que les Comores font face à ce fléau? Parce qu'effectivement, tous les jeunes, beaucoup de jeunes, par faute d'emploi, ils veulent émigrer vers l'étranger. C'est le cas de Maurice, c'est le cas des Seychelles, c'est le cas des Comores. Comment s'assurer que, comme vous avez bien dit, la création de l'emploi, les services, les opportunités sont là, chez nous. Et cela nous permet de vivre, de créer une famille, entre autres, de rester, de créer de l'emploi et de la prospérité. Comment est-ce que vous faites face à ce fléau?
Vraiment, c'est une question très importante. C'est vrai que nous traversons cette situation avec le taux de chômage qui est très élevé. Il y a beaucoup de jeunes qui ont été formés, c'est vrai, soit au niveau local, soit à l'étranger, mais une fois arrivés au pays, malheureusement, ils n'arrivent pas à obtenir de boulot. Et la politique du gouvernement, c'est de justement inciter ces jeunes-là à créer des entreprises pour pouvoir faire leur vie. Et il y a une structure d'ailleurs qui est au niveau national qu'on appelle ANPI, Agence nationale pour la promotion des investisseurs, que ce soit locaux ou bien étrangers. Donc, il est vrai que ce fléau pèse lourd au niveau du gouvernement. Et le gouvernement a constaté que non, pas seulement au niveau local, les autorités locales qui peuvent aider ces jeunes-là, mais aussi il faudra aussi un partenariat avec d'autres pays étrangers ou bien des investisseurs étrangers pour pouvoir résoudre ce problème-là. Donc, pour ne citer qu'un petit exemple, rien que 2022-2023, cette agence de la promotion des investissements a aidé beaucoup de Comoriens à créer à peu près 2300 emplois. Oui, 2300 emplois. Et puis, cette politique d'inciter des étrangers, des investisseurs étrangers à venir au pays, transformer les produits dont je viens de parler, ça va permettre aussi, ça va faciliter la création aussi de ces emplois-là et puis réduire aussi le chômage.
Très bien, merci beaucoup, Monsieur le ministre, pour cette réponse très importante. Minister Waldron, I have a tough question for you, but I feel you're ready for it. If I may, clearly, Guyana very well endowed in terms of resources, natural capital, forest, critical minerals, and there's a thrive and a desire for more access to critical minerals around the world right now. That's the buzzword, because not only it's important for decarbonization, it's also good for jobs, it's also good for the planet. Well, it depends, because some critical minerals are very thirsty for water, so it's not always a good one. But as you develop and as you grow from 49% to perhaps more in terms of your real GDP, as these demands for electricity, water, critical minerals rise, I'm curious to know how would Guyana manage those demands on one hand, but at the same time, if you were to be able to export those natural resources through higher value chains and new services, new products of the future, there are increasingly a lot of new regulations around the world, from the European Union to the United States to Asian countries, which make it very often extremely difficult to export products to those markets. And we know what they are. They can be, the new regulations on forestry. They can be border adjustments mechanisms. They can be, in the US also we have other rules and regulations. But I'll be interested to know how are your conversations with your European, with your American partners, if I may ask, how's those conversations with them, with your counterparts, and how is Guyana managing those complex new rules and new regulations for trade? And I'd like to ask the same question to Ambassador Wilson, if I may.
It is indeed a interesting and complex question. So as I mentioned earlier, Guyana has tied its developmental agenda to sustainable exploitation of these resources in which you talk about. And that is clearly outlined in our LCDS, our Low Carbon Development Strategy of 2030. And so we aim to balance our economic development with environmental stewardship. Now, this is the way which we seek to present our products to the marketplace, where we are, for instance, development and embracing certification schemes for fisheries, for example, ecotourism, renewable energy, in our view, enhances our marketability as a small state. And it allows us to tap into these environmentally conscious markets that partners that we have had, like Norway, for example, and other European countries, and even in North America. So that has been the niche. That is what we have been using to, we have approached and pursued these certification programs. So to show that we are doing our bit. We could make the argument that the burden for the climate change and all of that is disproportionately carried by the small states. But Guyana has embarked on our low carbon development strategy, and this is the way in which we find that we will access these markets. True.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you very much for the response. Matthew, are you concerned about these new trade regulations? Because on one hand, as I said, developing countries are well endowed, resource rich, and it's a bit of a challenge as these subsidies grow bigger in some parts of the world, leading a race to the bottom. How do small islands navigate those complex discussions in our committees here, in the WTO here, in the House here?
Thanks, Uvan. So I know that we're not in a law court, but I'm going to take a right of reply to Mr. Gill, Dr. Gill, because I think it's important at a session where we're talking about small states and small island developing countries. I don't want you to leave with the wrong impression. I don't want you to believe that we're not investing in our business procedures and our ease of doing business. Quite the opposite. But as I said before, sustainability is expensive, digitalization is expensive, and even this internal work around ease of doing business is expensive. Barbados is making some really positive moves here. We're setting up a new organization, Business Barbados, to do just this. But instead of focusing on us being 128th in the world and doing business, I want to focus that we are 60 out of 208 on Human Development Index. That for me is something that I really want to focus on. And in terms of the financial situation in small island developing states, it was Dominica that was hit by a hurricane. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. They lost 2 years of their GDP in 2 hours. So I want us to always keep in mind this whole issue of vulnerability and resilience when we're talking about the financial situation in developing countries like small states and how we manage our resources. There are many reasons why we're highly indebted. Barbados is highly indebted, although I will say that we have been, our debt to GDP ratio has been going down every year for the past 9 years. And the reason that we have the Bridgetown Initiative there is to address issues of debt and the financial situation. Now, I'm not going to say one of the reasons that we're in debt is because of the kinds of loans and the conditions that we got from the World Bank and the IMF in the past. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I wouldn't discount that, but I wouldn't say that. And this is one of the reasons why the Bridgetown Initiative is asking the World Bank and the IMF be more sensitive, be more aware of the particularities of small states in the kinds of loans and grants and financial programs that you're putting out there. And I'm happy to say that the World Bank is finally listening. Now, I can't even remember the question you asked me.
Because you're so focused on the other response.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. I just want to say 2 things on the WTO, Uvan. We are very concerned. We are very scared about the kinds of standards and regulations and expectations that we're seeing coming from our development partners. Our small businesses cannot meet the compliance requirements. It is simply, we cannot meet the compliance requirements. And there is nothing wrong with CBAM. There's nothing wrong with the Green Deal. There's nothing wrong with protecting people and health and animals. There is something wrong, however, about putting these standards out there in the ecosystem and not taking into account the negative implications that it will have on small states and small and medium-sized enterprises in the ACP. So my call to the EU and other partners has always been bring an aid for trade development sheen to these compliance procedures that you have there and help developing countries to be able to meet these requirements. Because if you don't, your biggest fear will continue to happen. And we know that the EU's biggest fear is irregular migration. So everything needs to come together so that we have a package that works for sustainability and it also works for development. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. This is a very strong plea and a very, very clear one. I'd like to ask maybe one more question to the chief economist before I open it to the floor. Dr. Gill, you've done a lot of work around green growth, the green agenda. Our chief economist here, Ralph Vosa, has done some impressive work around comparative green advantage, where you specialize in those products and services where you have a comparative green advantage and the benefits can be reaped. Do you think we can replicate that in the blue sectors? That is, countries and communities can specialize in those products and services that they have a comparative blue advantage, whether it be on blue finance, whether it be on natural capital, accounting, resources management, whether it be products from the sea, products from the ocean. Is that something, as a chief economist, you could see a replication of?
I haven't looked at that question, Yuvan, so I won't be able to give you an intelligent answer on it. But just looking at the natural resource and the point that Matthew mentioned, really high human development indicators, because these things tend to be they tend to require more innovation, and innovation requires high human development. And so as a result, I think that states like Barbados are, of course, actually very capable of doing that. They also require a lot of FDI. So I think that's the part that usually means like the kind of things that make countries easier to trade with, easier to do business in, easier to invest in, and so on, will tend to sort of help, right? But that's not an intelligent answer. So I just wanted to tell Matthew, I think part of the reason why I singled out Barbados, just by the way, has nothing to do with you or with what's happening right now. It is that when I was growing up in India, teams from the West Indies used to come and beat the hell out of India. And some of the best players were from Barbados, Sobers, Greenidge, Joel Garner, people like that. And the other really good players were from Guyana, which was Clive Lloyd, Rohan Kanai, Alvin Kalicharan, and others. So that's the reason why I'm being nice to Comoros and Mauritius and not so nice to Guyana and Barbados.
Excellent. Great. Mauritius that doesn't play cricket, but thank you so much, Indamit. I'd like to open the floor and I'd like to call first of all on one of our discussants, Glenna Han, who is Senior Fellow in the Environment Unit of Chatham House. She's done immense work around on embedded water, virtual trade of water. Which is also an incredibly important component of the blue economy, because the blue is not just the sea, it's also the oceans, it's also the lakes, the fresh lakes, the ponds, the rivers, and how we use our water in our exports, our imports, what kind of products we grow, really going to matter over the next few years. So Glada, I'd like to ask you, you've done some work on fragility, on you know, in countries that are affected by crisis. How did you hear about this panel in terms of its key messages? And if you could also touch a little bit on the work that you're doing around virtual water, because that's also very relevant for us. The DG also is one of the co-chairs on the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. There's a new economics work coming up, a new report coming out in the next month. So I'd like to really get your sense. What's the importance of embedded water or virtual trade of water in the blue economy development?
Thanks so much, Yuvan, and it's a pleasure to hear from this panel. I first of all wanted to say that it's really fascinating to hear from two countries almost at different ends of the spectrum in terms of water resources. You know, one relatively rich in water and expecting to use a lot for hydropower and new industry, and the other relatively water poor, but with an agenda, you know, with the Green Climate Fund to really make that those water resources resilient. Both governments have taken this positive approach to nature conservation, but they know they need to be rewarded for that, right? In terms of the way that trade is configured and the way that the importer countries value that respect for conservation. So I think in terms of what Ambassador Wilson mentioned at the end there, partnerships that will work for sustainability and development is going to be key for enabling this. So I'll come back to that at the end with respect to water specifically. And we also know that both countries are vulnerable to climate impacts. And as Indramit mentioned in the beginning, you know, this is a case for all SIDS and SVEs, and you will see drought, storms, floods, things that both impact on your water cycles and predictability, but also really, really challenge local resilience. So on your question, Yuvan, and thank you for asking me that on embedded water. Maybe I'll start with a number. So traded goods, so the goods that are traded globally are estimated to amount to 30% of freshwater abstraction. Now, that's not a problem in itself. They could be coming from really water-rich areas. But how it's actually happening is a problem. Firstly, we have highly unsustainable use that's in conflict with SDGs and climate resilience. So I really want to make the point that for the rich importing countries, and I'll come back to that, who are investing in climate resilience and investing in SDGs, there is this push to make their trade policy coherent in terms of water and other climate-related assets. So in many cases, there's three issues here. In many cases, depleting groundwater and rivers have ramifications for the neighboring, for the communities and the states that share those resources. And the allocation at present might not be perceived as fair. And that is, as you mentioned, fragility, conflict. In a lot of the areas that I've worked in, that is a serious source of contention. You can look at the impact on farmers in Punjab. You can look at southern Iraq. I know groundwater is a huge issue for the Comoros, and that issue is going to be profiled at the desertification COP in Riyadh. Another is pollution. So we see China, which is essentially the factory of the world, spending billions of dollars each year to clean up its rivers. In terms of the goods that it's produced for the world over the last 30 years. And we see horrendous impacts from extractives, textiles, other industrial manufacturing pollution in many countries. You mentioned critical minerals, that was mentioned this morning. You can see the impacts of copper production, for instance, including in the US. It's not just developing countries. And then you have the fairness in allocation, which I mentioned before. And you've seen protests actually taking place in Panama, in Azerbaijan, in Mexico, Iraq, other places I could mention where industry is seen to compete with the local uses. So they're the three things that I flag. And then secondly, where is trade headed? So it's generally headed from water vulnerable regions or climate vulnerable regions to richer industrialized countries. Nothing unexpected there. But a study that the NGO Water Witness commissioned last year showed that global north countries are dependent on external water sources for what they consume for about 40 to 80% basically of those products, and about 50% of the freshwater abstraction that's put into those products is coming from areas that are moderately to severely water scarce. So that's a kind of perverse situation, and there's basically no accountability for the importers or the industry that's benefiting from buying those goods. So we're working in this fast changing context. You mentioned this great report, which I recommend to anyone, Turning the Tide, which was produced by the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, where Dr. Ngozi is a senior advisor to that. And it came out, with some very scary statistics. It recognizes that we face this global systemic water crisis. Freshwater abstraction has gone through the roof over the last 50 years. Points out that we're breaching planetary boundaries in the water cycle. We are this is going to disrupt trade and development. So it is a risk for industries and countries that import. And the report says trade policy must be used as a tool for more sustainable use of water, and we must make sure that trade policy doesn't make the situation worse. Well, right now, there isn't really anything out there in terms of multilateral trade policy or bilateral trade agreements that really impact on the way that export-led industries are producing. And we produced this report, which I'm happy to give you a link or a copy on tackling trade-related water risks earlier this year, because we tried to look at what there was, and we really didn't find anything apart from some emerging regulation in the EU related to corporate responsibility, but it doesn't really have the teeth it needs yet. And then you have the opportunity, the possibility that this becomes a race to the bottom. Just want to say, I guess, to finish, it's not just a developing country problem. In my country, the UK, we've had huge problems with underregulated water, where companies were basically willing to take the risk of fines because the profits were bigger. And so there's a power imbalance often between the industries and the ability of institutions to enforce, which Indemit mentioned. So I think the partnerships need to focus on that issue. And I guess if you're interested in this issue, we're working on what I think is a initiative with really high potential called Fair Water Footprints, the Fair Water Footprints Partnership, which is supported by the UK. It's just got the go ahead to really scale up. So I recommend you to find out about it. But the idea is that it takes forward the recommendation in that report for just water partnership.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. That's very kind. Maybe I'll take two more questions from the floor before we wrap up. I recognize Professor Jean-Yves Remy from Schudat-Rumfeld University.
you
And
so
also our
much.
condolences to the passing of She.
And thank you so much, and wonderful panel. I just wanted to add one dimension to the discussion and see if any of the panelists had thoughts on this. Obviously, we're talking about the blue agenda, encouraging you, Matthew, here to lead a new blue deal. I've heard about that at UNCTAD. Wonder if we can catalyze a negotiating round around the blue economy, and Yuvan, you and Matthew maybe concoct a new round looking at all of these disparate parts into one agenda, because now we're still looking at it in very different ways. Whereas I think if we look at it in terms of all of the ecosystem of the blue economy, there might be some interesting synergies. But my question is slightly different. It's about shipping. And just cognizant, also the World Bank doing some interesting work on decarbonization of shipping, and the new agenda, the GHG reduction strategy that organization is engaged in, which sets thresholds up to 2050 to decarbonize shipping. I was wondering if there are any thoughts of how the WTO is engaging on that, because one of the basket of measures looks at the economic measures and a levy. Great money, billions of dollars that maybe can be siphoned off into different climate projects, including the loss and damage fund, some ideas about the Green Climate Fund, and maybe the WTO Sustainability Fund. And also, I'll be quick in terms of thinking about how SIDS in particular, I mean, Matthew, he just hosted something in Barbados on the Global Supply Chain Forum, recognizing how problematic shipping is and shipping routes to the Caribbean and other SIDS are. So wondering if there's a greater appetite in this house for reconciling these various at the technical level because of the carbon price issue, but also at the negotiating level in doing more work on climate and shipping in the WTO. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Maybe we take one last question. I see the gentleman in the back. If you could introduce yourself quickly and very quick question.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Reich, je viens des îles du Cap-Vert. Et nous aussi, je suis fonctionnaire du ministère de l'Industrie, Commerce et Énergie. Aussi, nous, comme des petits pays insulaires, aussi, on a des mêmes problèmes au niveau de l'économie d'échelle. Ma question, c'est surtout pour les représentants du Banque mondiale, c'est par rapport aux questions d'économie d'échelle et les petites îles. Comme vous avez bien dit, l'économie d'échelle à deux niveaux. Pour nous, nous sommes 10 îles. Il faut avoir 10 aéroports, 10 ports. Tout ça, ça va répliquer les coûts qu'on a au niveau de notre économie, pour s'intégrer au niveau de l'économie mondiale, mais aussi pour dire que les petits États insulaires aussi sont importants, jouent un rôle important au niveau du commerce international dans la lutte contre le piratage, aussi pour les fournitures des navires, aussi les petits États insulaires, aussi les câbles de fibres optiques qui traversent le continent, aussi les pays insulaires sont très importants au niveau des commerces mondial. Ma question, c'est surtout savoir comment surmonter la question d'économie d'échelle en savant que l'économie d'échelle, c'est les choses les plus importantes au niveau de compétitivité, au niveau du commerce international. Merci.
Merci, chers collègues du Cap-Vert, aussi une très belle île insulaire. Intimate, on the Cap-Verdean question, and any other final thoughts you may have.
So I think that you stated the problem really well. I think that the Caribbean countries have been doing things that are quite innovative. I think having a single central bank for more than one country, that's a good thing to do. Having essentially common policies that helps too, to the extent that, of course, it encourages greater trade between these economies, especially for services and so on. But also what it does is it actually lowers the costs of other countries to trade with these countries, because they know that they can conform to one country's rules and regulations, and it allows them access to all of them. The third part, of course, is actually exchanging information about what works, what doesn't. So, for example, I was given a really good example by the governor of the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. I think his name is Tim Antoine. So he said that when the World Bank actually used to do the doing business indicators, what they asked the World Bank to do a special exercise. They said that among the Caribbean countries, if you look at, we had these 10 categories of indicators. And they said, take a look at which Caribbean country does the best in each of those 10 categories. And if you then add up those and say, if every Caribbean country did as well as the best Caribbean country, how would the rankings change, right? And they would change, improve massively. So you end up then having essentially a group, so you end up having a group of countries that actually start to sort of not just look more like each other, but also look a lot more like the best countries. I think the part of the world that has done that pretty well, besides the European Union, of course, because they're special and they do it brilliantly. But the other part of the world economy that has done well, they are the ASEAN countries. They've been doing this very, very well too. So I think taking a page from taking a page from ASEAN, because they also had this problem of economies of scale, especially when it came to big economies like China and Japan and the US, and they managed to sort of harmonize these things well. I'm not giving you a good answer, but I think that's where it lies. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do any of the panelists wish to respond to Jean-Yves? Maybe Matthew?
No, I'll be very, very quick. You know, yesterday at the high level panel, I think it was Adam Posen who said that the WTO needs to figure out where it needs to be, but just as importantly, where it doesn't need to be. So on things like carbonization of shipping, I know a lot of the discussions are happening in the IMO, I believe it is, and small states are very much at the forefront of some of those discussions. Where I think the WTO probably needs to get better, and this is where it will contribute to issues around decarbonization, is a better definition of what exactly a green subsidy is. Because frankly, I don't think anybody really knows, which is why we're having all this consternation with the IRA. We're having all this consternation with the EU Green Deal. We're having all these discussions on this tension between industrial policy and policy space, because we don't quite know, many of us, what we can do, what we should do, what is allowed, what is not, whether or not the existing rules are fit for purpose for the 21st century. So I think it will make more sense for the WTO to have a real discussion on something like that. Thanks.
Just to add on what Ambassador Wilson mentioned, the DG is actually having a dialogue as we speak with some CEOs of those shipping container companies to precisely look at, trade issues, decarbonization, real data, etc. Let me maybe bring this discussion to a closure by first of all thanking our panelists who've been really, really instrumental in providing top-notch insights from their own fields of expertise. I think I go away with this meeting thinking of two, three things. One is that the blue economy is possible to make it happen and to make it last. And for that to happen, a number of the advice we've received from the World Bank, from the ministers, from Matthew as well, is how we do it, where we do it, how we accelerate blue growth over the next few years. What are some of the challenges that needs to be navigated through? Clearly, the opportunity is there for countries to specialize in the blue sectors and services, and to do it very quickly, because otherwise we do miss the boat. Otherwise, with climate change, with people leaving, brain drain, you name it, exogenous shocks, the challenges on small islands, vulnerable economies is going to be bigger. What I also go out here is that there is a demand for us to do more at the WTO on the blue economy, but more specifically on how small islands and SVs can harness that potential. And that, of course, there are some elements of these in different working programs for the SVE, but probably not a dedicated one. But I guess with the partners like the EIF, the World Bank, financial institutions, and MDBs, we can really do something, look into that and do something quite concrete for small islands as we reach major milestone events next year, the UN Oceans Conference in Nice 2025. In the end, the ocean economy, the blue economy is everybody's business. There is no difference with the green economy. And we will not achieve a green economy if we don't take care of our oceans, of our natural assets, our water, and our fisheries, etc., and our critical minerals. And vice versa. There will be no blue economy if we continue polluting, if we continue depleting our inland resources. So I think this panel really managed to, I think, also convince the fact that there is quite a lot happening. And despite these, hearing from the minister from Comoros and the minister from Guyana, that small islands, SVs, and of course, Ambassador Wilson, small islands are not waiting. They're not in a sort of a follower type of seat. They are in the driver's seat. We've been managing the blue economy for years. It's not a new thing for islanders. C'est pas quelque chose de nouveau, but how we do it in a sustainable way and looking at new sectors so that the new sectors and the old sectors can be integrated into a sort of a macro-wide economy is what's new. So let me close here by really thanking the ministers for coming all the way to Geneva for this WTO Public Forum. Let me also thank heartedly Diana Arjun from the DGO, who has been instrumental in making this session happen. I'd like to also thank my colleagues from the EIF partnerships. So Simon, Paulin, of course, Ratnakar, and also all my colleagues from IERD who've been instrumental in making sure that this session goes really well. And of course, also our colleague Dimitar from Accession, who's been instrumental in our relationship with Comoros, and the World Bank colleagues who've been very, very patient and very appreciative of our work and collaboration. Thank you so much, and all the best. The blue economy is possible, it's real, and yes, SIDS and SVs will thrive in a reglobalized world. Thank you.